Gemini 2.5 Pro 0506 launched a couple of weeks ago, and everybody's been talking about it. It might just be a breakthrough for vibe coders because it can produce some of the most impressive code projects on its first attempt. And what's interesting here about this model is that they actually upgraded the model, yet the pricing remains the same. But how does it stack up against other models when it comes to coding? Well, we ran a test on these models to get a sense of where Gemini 2.5 Pro 0506 stands, apart from benchmarks, apart from the hype on X. And so with that said, welcome to Plevo Deep Dive. I'm Caleb Friesen, your host, and today we're going to be discussing how Gemini 2.5 Pro 0506 marks an improvement over Gemini's 2.5 Pro preview. And we're also going to be taking a look at how it stacks up against competitors like GPT 4.1 and Claude 3.7 Sonnet. And looking specifically at GPT 4.1, it's not a reasoning model, but it does still demonstrate a strong ability to code. This was highlighted by the SWE benchmark, where GPT 4.1 achieved a 54.6% success rate in resolving issues end-to-end, which is a significant improvement over GPT 4.0 at 33.2% and GPT 4.5, which ranged between 28 and 38% depending on the source. We're also going to be comparing it with Claude 3.7 Sonnet, both with and without extended thinking enabled. And this comparison is especially useful because in both cases, Claude functions as a reasoning model, but with extended thinking mode enabled, it's given more time to think before responding. So we've run the same test using the same prompt across all of these different models, and we're going to break down what each one of these models brings to the table and how it differs from its previous version as well. So let's get into it. Now, this is the prompt that we're going to be feeding into each of these models. Write a Python program that simulates dice falling into a box that tilts back and forth. The dice should fall under gravity, collide with each other, and stack realistically based on physics. The container should tilt smoothly, causing the dice to shift and slide. And we've used this prompt mainly to evaluate the model's ability to emulate physics, including gravity, collision response, and how well the dice stack and settle. And another consideration is that the tilting box needs to move smoothly and influence the dice in a believable way, causing them to slide and shift naturally. Dice should tumble as they fall, display random faces when they land, and interact convincingly with both the box and other dice. So firstly, we're going to be giving this prompt to a Gemini 2.5 Pro preview, the older version of 2.5 Pro. And here we've got the code, so let's just run this test. Okay, so this does seem like a pretty good attempt, although it didn't quite get the dice looking right. The gravity and the physics do seem correct though, but when the box moves, the dice just seem to get out of line. I'd give it a 2.5 out of 5. It's just struggled too much with the physics accuracy and visual clarity for the dice here, but let's see if the updated version of 0506 can fix this. And here's how it performed. Okay, so that seemed pretty compelling to me. It added its own colors here too, even though that wasn't a part of the prompt. The objects don't exactly look like dice here either. It's still a solid attempt though. However, as you might have noticed, the box also doesn't really look like a box. It didn't in the previous version either. And I see what it was trying to do here, but unfortunately it did not quite hit the mark. So I'd give it a 3.5 out of 5. This version followed through on the physics and dice movement, but completely missed creating a proper box and realistic looking dice. But the physics seem right. When it's tilted, the blocks or cubes, I'm not gonna call them dice here, they roll and tumble as they should. And that's what you'd expect to happen if the box were actually tilting. The issue is that the box itself doesn't move. It has functions that make the contents shift and tilt, but the box remains static. So now let's take a look at GPT 4.1 and see if it can actually make the box move. So GPT 4.1 did manage to generate the box and followed the prompt fairly well. However, the simulation was quite chaotic. The tilting was too fast. The cubes placed directly on top of the box fell off due to gravity. And so I'd give it points for incorporating gravity, but overall, just too much was happening at once here. I'd rate this a 2.5 out of 5. It was a decent attempt, but it lacked control and clarity. Okay, so next we have Claude 3.7 Sonnet, and we have an enabled extended thinking mode here, so let's see what it comes up with. Okay, so Claude did pick up on the dice part. Those dice are represented correctly. And this is what a die is supposed to look like, right? With the other models, we mostly got cubes that kind of function like dice, but didn't really look like them. The only part that was missing here, however, was the tilting of the box. First of all, there was no box, so no points for that. And then on top of that, the movement was incredibly slow. It did notice, I noticed that it attempted to tilt something, but it wasn't very distinct. So I'd give this a 3.5 out of 5 because it did follow the prompt in representing the dice accurately, but missed out on key elements like the tilting of the box and believable movement. Okay, so now let's test it with Claude 3.7 Sonnet, but with extended thinking switched on. So I would say that these visuals are actually the best that we've seen so far. There's some user interaction as well, even though that wasn't prompted. And we can change perspectives by tilting the camera and even nudge the dice off a little bit. But we won't be comparing that. It's a fun addition, but it's not really what we were asking for, looking for. So from what I could tell, it took a creative approach here. It failed to fully register the cubes as dice, which is a bit surprising because the standard version of Claude 3.7 Sonnet actually produced more accurate looking dice. And even with more time to reason through the task, it didn't quite catch on to the details here. It brought in more colors and creative elements, but it didn't fully stick to the prompt. That said, this version was definitely more imaginative in its approach compared to the other models. So I'd give this a solid 3 out of 5. It did attempt to do something here, but it was too creative in its approach. But that was the main test that we ran on these models. So let's zoom out for a second and compare all of these models at once. We mentioned that we'd evaluated on several criteria like physics, realism, the box tilt behavior, dice movement, stacking, and stability. And so now, based on the dice simulation test, 0506 did remarkably well in certain aspects, though it didn't quite nail all of the specifics. And I believe that if we had modified the prompt to get a little bit more specific, it probably could have produced better results here, but you'd likely need to debug it several times in order to get it to the final result that you're after. And so it seems like we have a tie between 0506 and Claude 3.7 Sonnet here, the base version, not the extended thinking version of Claude 3.7 Sonnet. 0506 had realistic physics with cubes rolling naturally, but it didn't make a proper tilting box and missed out on the dice details. Claude got the dice details correct, but failed to build a clear box, and the tilt was too slow. So both missed the key part of the prompt in one way or another, but apart from the criteria, comparing 0506 to its older version, Gemini 2.5 Pro Preview, 0506 might have been more visually engaging. However, the preview version did at least attempt to create a tilting box, even if the dice sometimes escaped. And so 0506's version missed out on the box, and this was a notable step back for this particular part of the task. So now when we look at the other models, 0506 did manage to avoid the chaotic simulation that GPT 4.1 produced. Claude 3.7 Sonnet, with its extended thinking mode enabled, went in a more creative direction with this and offered good visuals with some user interaction, but that just wasn't what we asked for. And it just didn't stick to the given prompt thoroughly. And so in short, while Gemini 2.5 Pro 0506 could generate an interesting and dynamic output straight away, it seemed to prioritize a certain that visual appeal over strictly following the prompt's core requirements for a functional tilting box and distinct dice. So with this particular prompt, while it gave a pretty good shot, I would say it tried its best, it didn't quite hit the mark. Gemini 2.5 Pro 0506 and Claude 3.7 Sonnet are both reasoning models built to handle complex tasks like physics and object interactions, and this likely helped Gemini with cube movement and Claude with dice visuals. And in all fairness, GPT 4.1 isn't a reasoning model, but still did fairly well, though its output was more chaotic. Claude's extended thinking mode should have helped, but it focused too much on visuals and lost track of the prompt. So that about wraps up our test for these models, and I'd love to know what you've tried building with Gemini 2.5 Pro 05, 06 so far. Let us know if there are other models that you'd like us to test and compare, and if these tests help you to decide what model to use for your own tasks, then make sure to let us know in the comments, and also hit subscribe if you want to keep seeing videos like this in your feed. All right, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.